in providing services for our clients. We generally are not called in when trees are young and healthy and have no problems. We're called in when they find problems in trees, or when they see problems, or when a branch breaks out of it. Oftentimes, the jaded salesman in this industry will say that the clients don't look up if it's not May until Labor Day, unless the tree falls in their house. So one of the things we want to look at when we start doing tree risk assessment, I'm sorry, it got kind of small, but everybody has this handout here. And the first thing is recognizing what's a hazard in a tree and what's just function of a tree, or what's good or what's bad function in a tree. So for example, on the left side here, at the top it starts out with pollards, which is going to be incorrect cutting at the top right there. Breakout cavity, where old things have been cut off and the wound was too large. The research shows currently that if you cut into a tree limb and it is already dark and discolored in the center, which is technically the heartwood, that wound will not close in your lifetime. That's what the research right now shows. So in Colorado, that's about a 4-inch cut. And then we start seeing the discoloration in the middle of the ash and the maple. That wound likely won't close in the next 20 or 30 years. On the East Coast, where you have more oaks, more weather, more water, more conditioning, more growth, Northwest also, that's about a 9 to 10 inch cut. So it's different in different regions of the country based on how things grow. As you guys can see here, one of the other handouts I gave out that's really important to comprehend about trees is this limb started a long time ago, and it's inside the trunk. And it was wrapped around different layers and laminates of new cell growing each year. So the limb that we cut off, that's the size of my arm, doesn't just start right here on the trunk. It goes in very much into the center where that tree was younger, and it kind of funnels down to where it started. That's how branches are attached. So when we cut them, or they get cut, or they get broken, that wood that was part of that branch going inward does decay. Now the process that we work with as climbers and as plant healthcare, as salesmen, as stewards of care of trees comes into the third handout, which is called CODED, which is compartmentalization of decay in trees. Trees don't heal. Trees don't grow new legs like starfish. They don't grow new tails like salamanders. They don't grow new scabs over the same skin like humans do, or dogs do, or cats. They don't heal. So in your rest of your career, try not to say trees heal. You're wrong. We are professionals. Homeowners can say they heal, but we know better. They have wound response. They have wound closure. Not all of things happen based on the size cuts we make, as we talked about before. When we get back into some of the basic biology and how that affects, here, a tree risk assessment form that you guys have, some of you have, this shows how detailed we look at trees before we go into whether we say they're a risk to someone or some object or some landscape, whether it's a playground or a church or even the back of this building. We have this Lombardy poplar with big dead in it, but there's very few targets underneath it. It's the back of a building where Tom's not in his office very much, where Kevin's only in his office in the mornings or afternoons, and then a receiving dock on the building. So that tree and its hazards is a small issue in risk assessment compared to an apple tree that's in a playground, or a large maple tree that's in a courtyard in a church. So depending on where we are and what's being used is going to define how much of a risk or not risk something is and that we have to take care of. All that going back to it, the hazards of trees as we know them are defined by physical and physiological responses in the tree from what happens to it over its life. Lots of water, moderate fertilizer, good slow growth like an oak tree, they're really strong. Lots of water, great fertilizer, a maple tree, never going to be strong. So certain types of trees, certain types of growth in trees is also relevant to their processes. One of the things that I wanted to talk about today, most importantly though, was how wounds and hazards affect different trees and what we do with them. Over here, I've drawn just a trunk. This is going to be indicative of a wound right here. If anybody can see around me, the circle in the middle. Up and above it, what I've drawn are some relevant to conchs or decay of what happens on the outside of trees where mushrooms then form. Now, as we see, these are pretty big ones. These examples they have photos of. What I wanted you guys to note is that the larger the conch, the closer to the decay pocket inside the wood we are. So if we have a really big mushroom growing next to an old 10 or 12 inch cutoff in a maple, and below it is a half the size mushroom, and below that a couple inches is an even smaller mushroom. As the mushrooms get smaller, the decay pocket is smaller, the structural wood is stronger, the risk is less. So depending on where, if we're having to rig a top out when we're climbing a tree and there's mushrooms or decay up there, you don't want to tie in above that. You want to tie in, if you can, below that. You don't want to put your load bearing of your rigging point above that. You want it below that. Now, some trees have great display, particularly in more humid environments, of these conch and these decays. We are not blessed with that out here in Colorado. What we are blessed with is an absence of fungus eating wood. We don't have armillaria, we don't have hypoxylon, we don't have some of the major players that trees fail unexpectedly on tree climbers or tree service professionals on the East Coast. I know climbers that are better than all of us in this room put together, and they have fallen out of trees doing nothing wrong. I know a guy who fell 70 feet out of an ash tree and landed on the back end of his chipper when the top blew out from a rigging point. I know a guy here in Colorado who fell out of a 25-foot Norway maple and landed on a bird bath and broke his back and got more damage done to him, falling 22, 25 feet in Colorado out of a Norway maple that had a sun scald injury in the top he didn't realize was under the bark, compared to a guy who fell out of a 140-foot ash tree in Georgia and landed on a chipper. So it can happen anywhere. It can happen at any time, but if we don't know what we're looking for, we don't know what risk that we're trying to mitigate. We don't know what risk we're putting ourselves at. So the size conch is important. It's one of those measurable characteristics that we can see. The bigger it is, the closer to the decay pocket it is. As it gets smaller and less decay shows on the outside of the bark, less decay is available to feed that decay-eating fungi. Another thing that I want to talk about here in Coded Part 1 and 2 on this is when we look at where wounds are here on the tree and how decay goes in, what we see with compartmentalization of decay in trees has four directions. One is up and down. So the vertical spread of the decay pocket is going to be the biggest. It will spread the most up and down because water and gravity spread the most that way, and will take decay fighting cells, and will also not be able to push the chemicals that change regular wood into wound response wood. So number 2 is going to be inward to the core or outward to the bark. Number 3 is going to be radially, like a clock, counterclockwise or clockwise, side to side. And number 4, when we cut open a tree and we see when we cut open a tree and we start seeing these lines of darkness before it decays out, we will see dark wood in here, usually black line almost, a very brown or black line into your regular shape. That's the chemical wall inside the tree that makes it compartmentalize the decay. Compartmentalizing the decay is going to be something we're looking forward to as an end result. For here example, we have, let's consider this just a backyard tree with 3-phase going through the canopy. They've taken off some branches. It's got a 10-foot clearance on one side. There's some branches that come out under the wires, and the rest of the canopy comes to this other side. If this wound is an old wound that used to come up and under the wires and they cut it out, and all this weight is on the other side, the risk is actually pretty high here because we have a wound on one side, we have the weight on the opposite side. So that leads to a higher fulcrum point of physics, going back to high school math and science classes. So if we have this kind of wound that's in a major trunk hole or decay pocket from where they haven't made a cut at an appropriate time when it was young enough for the tree to have a wound response, or this was a storm damage, an ash tree, this broke out and you had to cut it back. That's where you start looking at the balance and the structure of the tree so that you can assess the risk. Sometimes before we get up here and we start cutting on this, we might want to go up and just remove half of the weight. We might want to mitigate the situation by reducing the forces that are in the situation. This one over here on the right I've drawn is a common issue. Let's call this just a regular tree along the street. It's got a nice motor vehicle accident down here at the base where a drunk kid or somebody showboating in their sports car or whatever ran a stop sign, slid through the snow. We've got a basal wound right above the basal flare. That's going to affect how much growth can get up to the top and regrow, whether that's going to be thick or thin. We have a nice topped maple because 30 years ago, that's what everybody who had no intelligence in the matter said, you know, I want my tree to be shorter. I want it to still have shade, but I don't want it above the house. I don't want leaves in my gutter. We've heard all these excuses of why this tree needs to be altered drastically to fit their landscape, but nobody ever says, well, once you top it, everything that grows back is attached poorly and is going to fall off easier and quicker and in more decay, like damage. The ice storm we got in 2012, I was standing in a front yard with a lady as branches were breaking in this nice 60-foot maple over off of 52nd and Arbutus. Is that it? Arbutus. You know, you guys can tell me how to pronounce it. I'm Southern. And we were standing on this maple, and branches are cracking and popping from all the ice. We walk around the house to look at a willow, and right where we had been standing, a regrowth of about 4 inches popped out and landed on the driveway. Could have hit either one of us if we were standing there looking up at a tree. But these maples that these people have done this to in Denver, most common problem that I see, have a lot of risk. They're poor compartmentalization of decay. Every time we get in a maple, they have those big holes in them. They're the best wood to pick up because they're hollow inside. You pick them up and you're like, look how strong I am. Well, it's hollow inside. They just don't see it from the side. So in terms of this, you can see with this kind of wound at the base here, we have less growth on one side. We're not getting nutrient transport. We're not getting a fullness to the canopy. And then the rest of it's been topped, and it's all regrowth that's piss poor to climb in. It's piss poor to rig in. It's piss poor to climb in. It's piss poor structure. And it's probably only going to provide shade for half the time it should have if they would have pruned the tree correctly. Those are a different conversation for a different day. The thing is about tree risk assessment is that not every tree in every situation is the exact same. There are fundamentals that you can take from just perusing or looking over this sheet here, whether we're talking about the site. The first thing they talk about here, besides you writing down the tree and the problems, you can see the first question they ask about, site changes. That's the first thing we talk about. Have you put in a new driveway? Look at this brand new driveway next to this tree. I wonder where the roots went. They went in the back of the truck with the fill soil. Site clearing. Oh, we have cleared this whole place out, but we left this beautiful cottonwood here at the entrance of Cottonwood Villas. Welcome to Cottonwood Villas. And that cottonwood falls over. Why? Because they put a road over its roots. You know, so the first thing that they talk about when you talk about tree risk assessment is what's changed that we're not going to talk about otherwise. Did you put in a new neighborhood over there, and now none of the water that used to come through this farm comes down and they're all drying out 4 years later? Have you put in a new road over there and diverted all the drainage that used to come across the road and feed these trees at the bottom of the gully, and now they're drying out and they're at risk of dying? You know, so the site changes is the most important thing when we start wondering, why is this different than what it should be? We don't have the opportunity many times. The salesmen do, but as service providers, us in the Green Church in this room, we don't have an opportunity to go see that tree every 3 or 4 years. We might not be on the same crew, but the salesmen do. So Tom and Kevin and Tony, they're going to be like, oh, well, gosh, last time I was here, you know, you didn't have a neighbor. They built 4 houses up over here behind you, and they've changed the water. And did they drive right on the backside of your property here, on the backside of your trees, and that's where they took in all the fill dirt, that's where they took in all the material? So they've compacted those roots on this half of this tree. You know, so everything we look at when we start looking at tree risk assessment is not saying, well, that's a wound and it's going to fail. That's not the truth of it.